Students and teachers and trainers, professors and professionals, learners and listeners, I Dr. Rakesh from USA. I heartily cordially welcome all of you. The most honorable present Prime Minister Dr. Narendra Modi ji, availability of respected ministers and doctors, reverend fathers and mothers, affectionate sons and daughters, those who are listening. It is really nice time, nice place, nice action, listening with 100% present sense of mind. It's God's grace. I thank God for providing this valuable time to know about communication. Simply, what is the meaning of communication? Receiving and sending of the message. Our scholars read, speak, write and listen for learning these four modules in language. Language itself is the part of communication. In communication, we study how our internal organs communicate each other, how the messages are conveyed by one cell to another cell in the human body. In medical science, we study it. External communication devices that we use at home in the different fields of science, medical science, health, education, in all the fields of technology, electronology and digitology. We understand it that it is possible only by ray of light and wave of sound. So in the same series we are studying according to Alan Lewis, communication is the sum of all the things. Communication is the sum of all the things a person does when he wants to create an understanding in the mind of another. It involves a systematic and continuous process of telling, listening and understanding. As per John Adair, communication is essentially the ability of one person to make contact with another and to make himself or herself understood. Keith Davies describes communication as the process of passing information and understanding from one person to another. It builds bridges of meaning between people, enabling them to safely cross the rivers of misunderstanding. In the process of communication, there is a sender or the speaker or the writer who has a message for an intended receiver, the listener or the reader. Now this message is encoded by the sender, who puts it in accordance with the rules of the language being used. The capacity of the receiver, the nature of the medium through which the message is being sent, and the protocols of the space where the communication is being attempted. When the message reaches the intended receiver, he or she decodes it following the rules of the language used. His or her state of knowledge to interpret the message and the protocols of the space surrounding this exchange while dealing with the problems, if any, of the medium through which the message is sent. Now, depending on what and how much the receiver is able to understand, he or she gives a feedback to the sender. The nature of this feedback indicates whether the sender has been successful, partially successful, or unsuccessful in communicating what he or she wanted to convey to the intended receiver. Ineffective modes of communication not only act as barriers to productivity but also hinder our chances of success in personal and professional pursuits. Mastering the nuances of communication in personal and professional spheres has become imperative. Correspondingly, institutions and universities offer special papers or courses for individuals to improve communication skills with an application and activity oriented continuous evaluation system in place. There are robust rubrics for the assessment of every activity, designed astutely to check the effectiveness of communication skills in different contexts. For instance, we can gauge someone's writing prowess through an email writing activity revolving around an expression of interest against an advertised vacancy. Likewise, speaking proficiency can be tested through a mock interview activity, simulating the possibility of the applicant being called for an interview. The most important communication skills that you need to focus on are listening, speaking, non-verbal communication, writing, reading, empathy, empathizing. Why are communication skills important? Human beings by nature are not sedentary entities but require social clustering for expression of emotions, exchange of information, and to satisfy the need to communicate and bond. From the notion of society came along the notion of speech community. Human beings by nature are not sedentary entities, but requires social clustering for expression of emotions, exchange of information, and to satisfy the need to communicate and bond. From the notion of society came along the notion of speech community, which Lyon's 1970 perceived as a community where all the people use a particular language or dialect with different stages in the evaluation of the human society. There have been consequent revisions in the concept of a speech community with the advent of the ideas of an information society in 1930 and onwards. Virtual speech communities followed a few years later. Throughout the history of mankind, societies have accorded importance to skilled users of language or skilled communicators, as language perpetuated perpetuates all domains of human participation, accomplishing the role of a binder. Some people are very skilled at getting what they want through the use of language, and others are not. Skilled language use tends to be respected in many cultures. So, mastering the process of communication attributes special status to people irrespective of the modality. Improving our communication skills in fundamentally Improving our communication skills is fundamentally about equipping ourselves as future professionals and as responsible individuals with the necessary skills and resources to be able to use language powerfully, to share as well as receive ideas effectively in person or professional context. Moving beyond language, the process of communication, the roles of the participants, the barriers and the nature of the message need to be carefully explored while learning about the nuances of effective communication. As future professionals and dutiful citizens, we will always be functioning in objective and outcome oriented spaces. Language being the lingua franca and the universally shared common mode of understanding each other will be the language that we will need to maneuver in unique ways to accomplish different things like starting a relationship, expressing concern, congratulating a partner, inquiring about an issue, requesting for a favor, starting a relationship, negotiating a deal, starting a relationship, negotiating a deal, seeking clarification, expressing concern, persuading an individual, convincing a colleague, congratulating a partner, prospecting, proposing an initiative, planning a venture, inquiring about an issue, addressing a grievance, motivating a friend, requesting for a favor, solving a conflict, applying for an opportunity, and many others. How efficiently we speak, how efficiently we speak, as well as how convincingly we put across our perspectives will determine how successful we are to the process of communication. While speaking is about how and what we utter, we often forget that there needs to be significant emphasis on the non-verbal aspects of communication as well. For instance, gaze, eye contact, hand gestures, facial expressions, body posture, etc. The contemporary thrust on imparting or improving our communication skills is also intertwined with our employability, whereby the onus is on how humanly translatable is the technical or non-technical training imparted to resolve, manage and deal with real world issues in the field. Last but not the least is our temperament to tackle cross-cultural differences while communicating in a heterogeneous space and to understand without being judgmental how people belonging to diverse backgrounds communicate with an acceptable level of clarity. 7 C's of communication. Communication is beset by a number of impediments. Simple cognizance of these hurdles is not enough unless the participants stick to certain principles that make communication effective and fruitful. These are 7 C's of communication, namely clarity, conciseness, concreteness, correctness, courtesy, completeness, and consideration. Here, as we learn about the 7 C's, we need to move beyond an explanation of the 7 C's and connect them to their real world domain specific implications. Firstly, in the Indian context and then in the global context. Furthermore, we also need practical experience as well as to strive to improve in our successive interactions. Principle, clarity, basic idea, the message communicated needs to be clear, to be effectively understood, by the listener or the recipient, followed by relevant feedback from the listener or the recipient that confirms the success of the process. Applications. The important language related factors that speakers need to be careful about to preserve clarity are: one is vocabulary, to keep it as simple as possible without assuming anything about the receiver's competence. Vocabulary levels vary, and in the Indian context, in rich multicultural spaces, there are individuals differently trained in English, belonging to different socio-cultural backgrounds. Ambiguity. The message must also be free from both structural as well as semantic ambiguity to ensure that unintended interpretations are avoided. In the Indian context, with varying levels of proficiency in English and different ways to understand an ambiguous message can be catastrophic for the communication process. Third application: excessive jargonization. Heavy jargonization is ineffective in the Indian context due to stark differences in level of vocabulary as well as preference for non-technical expressions to improve comprehensibility in an uneven arena. Second principle is conciseness. The message communicated must be precise and to the point without any unnecessary details that do not serve the primary purpose and that can only waste the time of the listener or the recipient. What is in the application of the conciseness? The points that we need to stress on in the process of communication to maintain conciseness are: economy of expression. The use of words should be cross-checked to eliminate redundancies and paraphrased repetitions of the same message. While speaking, fillers and pet phrases need to be taken out of the picture. Moreover, subconsciously inserted expressions of an annoying frequency like "you see," "kind of," "definitely," "I mean," for example, basically need to be limited cautiously. Substituting cluttering phrases with economic alternative to be avoided due to the fact that, in view of the fact that, is of the opinion that, with the exception of, to be avoided due to the fact that, to be used because, in view of the fact that, to be used consideration, is of the opinion that, to be used believes. with the exception of to be used, except. These are just a handful of examples for putting across the point of concern, substituting roundabout sentences with the direct ones. To be avoided. This report. To be used, this report. Prepared with the. To be used, recommends. Objective of. To be used, certain retailers. Recommending certain. To be used, to expand. Retailers for the purpose of expanding business. This report has been prepared with the objective of recommending certain retailers for the purpose of expanding business. To be used, this report recommends certain retailers to extend business. It is compulsory for all the people present in the meeting to put their phones in the silent mode. To be used, all attendees in the meeting must put their phones in the silent mode. These are just few examples to highlight the issues. Principal concreteness. The idea conveyed must be specific. The idea conveyed must be specific and provide the listener a straightforward image of the intended message. Application. While engaging in a conversation, the issues that we need to be mindful of with respect to concreteness are: one is not making any vague or fuzzy statements. For instance, in case of a business proposal, invoking historicity without pertinent facts and figures is not effective. Vague statement. As a company, we have been reliable for a very long time. Correction. Consecutive awards for customer satisfaction in 2016 and 2017 highlight our efforts to retain and satisfy existing clients since the company started functioning in 2012, replacing abstract expressions with statical ones. To be avoided, unbelievable margin of discount. To be used, 25% discount. Very spacious. To be used, 4,500 square feet. A minor proportion. To be used, 5%. As early as possible. To be used by the 2nd of October 2020. These are just few examples to point out the issue. Next principle is correctness. The message. Next is correctness. Basic ideas of correctness is the message relayed must be free from grammatical mistakes and errors of pronunciation. In application, The points that we need to be cautious about while addressing the issue of correctness are: 1. For Indian English speakers, grammatical concerns like appropriate prepositions, omission and commission of articles, conjugation of verbs, and sentence schemes are quite troublesome. Number 2, in application, while conversing, incorrect pronunciation can create a bad first impression in the recipient's mind. Next principle is courtesy. What ideas to be followed in it? The message communicated must maintain a desirable level of courtesy and decorum with respect to the use of words, expressions, and tone. The nuances that we need to adhere to while dealing with the issue of courtesy are: substituting negative messages with their positive versions. To be avoided, your order cannot be delivered in their days, in 3 days. To be used, we will do our best to deliver your order within 4 days. To be avoided, we had to cancel your request for a replacement for the next week. To be used, we are extremely sorry. To be used, we are extremely sorry for the inconvenient, but we can process your request a for a replacement after the next week, replacing offensive expressions with euphemistic ones. To be used, disabled or handicapped. To be avoided, disabled or handicapped, and to be used, differently abled. To be avoided, third class performance. To be used, below par performance. These are handful of examples to highlight the issue. Next principle, completeness. Ideas. The message must contain every relevant details for the intended purpose and be apt regarding the necessary element. In application, as we take part in conversation, our focus to address the issue of completeness is on: one is rechecking thematically the inclusion of information that is essential for fulfilling the goal. For instance, if it is a conversation about a leisurely get together, it must certain details of the people to be invited or included, the place of the get together, the date and time of the get together, and the activities planned. Checking for missed details as per the requirements of the conversation. Next principle is consideration. Ideas. The message relayed must take into account the listener's or the recipient's profile, social background, cultural substitutes, cultural substi- cultural subsidies, preferences, nature, as well as beliefs to suit the listeners or the recipient's needs while fulfilling the speaker's purpose. In application, we must use the aspects that we need to prioritize to address the issue of consideration are: one is remembering the cross cultural intricacies. Remember the cross cultural intricacies. Anything that is colored with cultural bias has to be removed or remodeled. For instance, in a complete Indian conversational space, any comment praising or stereotyping a particular ethnic group can be disastrous. Statements to be avoided: these behaviors are still so uncouth. If it were not for the intelligence of the Malayalis, this company would be out of business. Steering clear of any religious or social dogmas and avoiding emotionally charged statements. Influence of barriers in the process of communication. The discussion on barriers is perhaps the most critical component of effective communication, considering the frequency of breakdown in communication that mar productivity and destroy reputation irrevocably. A barrier, simply understood, can be anything or anybody that prevents or hinders or unfavorably changes the intended outcome of a communicative exchange. Barriers can be intrapersonal, interpersonal, and organizational. As all of you are pursuing undergraduation from university, you are already functioning within the setup of a central university. Moreover, at the cusp of being employed, or some of you are employed already. Therefore, knowledge of organizational barriers and how to work around them becomes indispensable. The discussion will be fruitful if we focus on organizational barriers, as an individual's professional success is linked to his or her communicative efficiency within the organization where he or she is enrolled or employed or is going to be employed very soon. Every organization has its own hierarchy, communication protocols, as well as channels via which information flows between the layers. Mere academic substantiation of the types of organizational barriers is futile if we do not back them with lucid, real world illustrations. The major organizational barriers are: distortion of information due to several transfer stations, due to the multiple levels in an organization and the protocols of either upward or downward communication. When the message passes through several individuals, there is change of the original messages at every level. Information selectivity as well as poor listening amplify this distortion, and the intended recipient ultimately gets a mutated version of the message. In the Indian context, the problem comes with a ghastly, ghastly twist of exaggeration to sensationalize a piece of information, which becomes the latest gossip in grapevine. For instance, a conversation with the HR manager about availing a leave, and the stated reason can be maliciously distorted to the extent of appearing for interviews for changing job on the pretext of personal emergency. This is not only the toxic but also counterproductive. Repression or overflow of information due to fear of superiors. In the Indian context, to please the superiors and not incur their wrath, in many cases we repress issues or grievances. The reverse is also possible, where there is breach of confidentiality and unfiltered sharing of everything with the superiors to display subservience and win their favor. Loss of productivity due to negative tendencies generated through groupism and in-group out-group discrimination. Even within the same organization, groups based on interest, ethnicity, age and other factors may at some point of time experience a clash of beliefs leading to in-group out-group discrimination, which after a while can become really ugly and affect the decorum of conversation in the organization. Loss of communicative efficiency due to the selection of unsuitable media. Selection of media is dependent on four variables, namely time required for transmission of message, cost of transmission, nature of the message, and the target audience. In the Indian context, with the digital revolution, internet and smartphone applications have become the preferred media. However, if a recorded speech message is confidential, encrypted, services with self-destruct option, and a lifespan for the recorded message delivered need to be appropriate utilized. Most organizations use their own intranet with no access to the internet for confidentiality of organizational exchanges. Loss of productivity and communicative efficiency due to information overload and congestion of channels. When there is conversational salad of an excessive amount of irrelevant information with the relevant details, understanding and processing it decimates efficiency, and such a situation of information overload passively frustrates and burns out the listeners. The focus should be on the quality and not the quantity of spoken words. In the Indian context, such information overload situations are coupled with pass the responsibility trend, ultimately leading to a gridlock with no possible progress in communication. To deal with information overload, there needs to be someone monitoring the flow of conversation with some form of penalty like losing the turn to speak again or credibility as a speaker being compromised, etc. For those being careless enough to repeat information or include unnecessary details despite warning. Importance of cross cultural awareness in communication. One of the intriguing one of the intriguing challenges of the dynamic spaces that we communicate in these days is the fusion of an incredible number of cultures. Similar to a multicultural classroom, a multilingual and multicultural social setting requires delicate treatment. One of the focal points of critical discussion here is how prepared are we to accept differences while maintaining a productive and tolerant atmosphere where individualities do not require dilution. Communication in such context moves beyond the literal and the linguistic, and to make sense of the process, one needs to be aware of the multiple cultural variables at play. In fact, lack of awareness of cultural variations is one of the biggest interpersonal causes leading to communication failure. Cultural and social sensibilities govern perception, expectation, and tolerance with respect to any form of communication. Renowned cultural theorist Dr. Giri Hofstad's model on cross-cultural communication is a widely followed, robust theoretical premise, robust theoretical premise for studying how cultural differences impact communication involving participants of unique ethnicities and cultures. There are 6 dimensions discussed in Hofstede's model, namely power distance index (PDI), individualism versus collectivism, uncertainty avoidance index (UAI), masculinity versus femininity, long-term orientation versus short-term orientation, and indulgence versus restraint. Power distance index. Power distance index (PDI) deals with the societal distribution of power and how different communities function in a particular arrangement. A high degree of power distance signifies the acceptance of hierarchical order by the communities, whereby each community has its own position and the situation does not require any intervention. A long degree of power distance indicates ongoing struggle to balance the distribution of power and requires intervention to address the inequalities of power. In terms of communication, these translate into very different behavioral paradigm as well as linguistic expressions. An individual coming from a background of high power distance index will not be excessively polite nor excessively subservient, reflected through choices of expression in the spoken language, as they have been functioning within equitable power structures. On the contrary, someone from a low power distance index background can be at either of the extremities, that is, excessively polite and compliant, or excessively defensive and resistant, reflected through their choice of expressions in the spoken language. Individualism versus collectivism addresses the cultural difference whereby certain groups prefer a narrower domain of responsibility, being responsible only for themselves and their immediate families, with a high degree of independent existence in a liberal social matrix, and certain other groups prefer a wider domain of responsibility with a high degree of collaborative growth in a structured social matrix based on communal loyalty. In a diversified conversational space, participants with a collectivist background prove to be better listeners, better collaborators, and their linguistic choices reiterate as inclusiveness. We oriented sentences constructions, whereas participants with an individualist background, although more creative, do not function as efficiency do not function as efficiently in groups, and their linguistic choices underline exclusiveness. I oriented sentences constructions. Uncertainty avoidance index helps in understanding to what extent members of particular social group feel distressed when faced with uncertainty and indefiniteness around the central concern for an unseen future. The differences in mindset arise regarding whether efforts should be undertaken to control the future or just let the future unfold naturally in due course of time. Individuals belonging to backgrounds with strong UAI are structured, inflexible, action oriented, and their choice of expressions in the spoken language reflect precision and economy. In a dynamic conversational space, these translate into highly focused, punctual, problem solving individuals with a greater proportion of affirmative sentences while communicating. On the contrary, individuals from a weak UAI background are relaxed and flexible. In a dynamic conversational space, these translate into creative and unpredictable individuals who do not function effectively under stress, and their choice of expressions in the spoken language reflect elaboration, depth, and liberality. Masculinity versus femininity highlights the more frequent societal preference for masculine behavioral and aspirational matrices like accomplishment, chivalry, and recognition, assertiveness, as well as material fulfillment through success. The less frequent societal preference for feminine behavioral and aspirational matrices like assistance and partnership, decency and politeness, caring for the vulnerable, bring to the fore a distinct tough versus tender cultural gap in the context of a fiercely competitive conversational space. Masculinity is predominance in the cultures of India and China, contrary to the UK, Canada. Long term orientation versus short term orientation focuses on a group or a society's connectedness with its own past to tackle the complex issues of the present and the future. Societies that rely on time tested traditions and beliefs and therefore are not readily open to ideas of change. Then there are others that do not irrationally cling to traditions and explore changes and revisions with an open mindset in the conversational context. This distinction is also referred to as normative means short term versus pragmatic means long term approach. For instance, Indians, while being part of a conversation, are quite sensitive about their heritage and prefer abiding by proven traditions. On the contrary, Germans and Swedish are very open to any change for the positive. Indulgence versus restraint. Indulgence versus restraint outlines the societal scope for unrestricted fulfillment and gratification of fundamental and natural human drives that in turn influences happiness index and satisfaction. There are societies restraint oriented that suppress gratification along with the imposition of stringent regulations on expression of these drives or urges. But there are also others indulgence oriented that permit it quite openly. Considering the Indian context, such open gratification is tabooed and therefore a Mexican worker stationed in India might find things to be repressive, whereas certain Indians working in Berlin might be initially surprised by the liberal approval of these and their expression through spoken language. Moving beyond Hofstede's model, there are certain factors pointed out by Professor Lerere M. Barna as tumbling blocks in intellectual communication 1994. The six reasons that imperial intercultural communication as propounded by Professor Barna are as follows. Assumption of similarities, language differences, non-verbal misinterpretations, preconceptions and stereotypes, tendency to evaluate, high anxiety, influence of non-verbal cues in the process of communication. Many of us at some point of time have experienced that what we expressed verbally in a conversation failed to elicit a desired response even though we used apt expressions in grammatically correct sentences and articulated them in a manner that was perfectly understandable to the listener. Beyond possible occasional factors like being known to the listener or having a strained personal or professional relationship with the listener, or the listener being in an emotionally unstable situation in the time of the conversation, there is more to such experiences and therefore simply holding the mentioned occasional factors or similar ones responsible cannot always justly how and why the conversation transpired the way it did in those starting experiences or verbal messages were not considered as legitimate or serious or actionable. The listener did not state directly state that he or she found the relayed information questionable or unreliable. However, The nature of the listener's response clearly revealed the manner in which our messages were treated, and we felt we were not being believed or taken seriously. For instance, it could have been a request for some monetary help or a messages being relayed from previously inaccessible information being disclosed now in a changed circumstances, etc. In all such situations that we lived through, we are still pretty sure that our choice of meaningful words and construction of sentences were appropriate as well as adequate to convey the intended message in an intelligible manner. Yet, from all such episodes, we realized that somehow it was not sufficient to be perfect with our words, sentences, and grammatical sense. Then, what more is there to the process of verbally conveying meaningful messages and being able to get a desired response, and so to speak, to the process of any positive, productive conversation? Well, the answer is the appropriate of the non-verbal cues that accompany the verbal message. You will be surprised to know that it is these very non-verbal cues that influences the interpretation and the subsequent response to our verbal messages. That is in all two of the experiences that we were mulling over the non-verbal cues that our interclusters picked up from the way we conveyed that message were not powerful enough to support the verbal part of the message to be taken seriously, etc., or to found credible. Now, how exactly can we understand what is non-verbal? Well, for this, we need to approach the expression from two perspectives. The first is when we consider the aspects of communication, that is the process. Non-verbal cues are essentially those whose production or relay does not involve the vocal tract and the speech apparatus. So, from the point of view of communication, non-verbal cues include, for example, facial expressions, eye contact, hand movement, physical posture, etc. The second perspective is with when we deal with the features of speech, that is the medium. Non-verbal cues are essentially those which have nothing to do with the recognition of individual words in the speech stream. So, from the point of view of speech, non-verbal cues include, for example, accent, intonation, loudness, etc. Now, all these non-verbal cues from both the perspectives of aspects of communication and speech constitute that aspect of human language which lies beyond the articulation of words and sentences, but still significantly influences the interpretation of verbal messages and therefore has an undeniable impact on the overall communicative effect. The term paralanguage is broadly and simply used to refer to this. Abercrombie, in its paper Paralanguage 1968, writes, "We speak with our vocal organs, but we converse our entire bodies. Conversation consists of much more than a simple interchange of spoken words. The term paralanguage is increasingly commonly used to refer to non-verbal communicating activities which accompany verbal behavior in conversation, but Abercrombie at the same time warns of the potential danger of considering paralanguage as an independent, homogeneous entity, parallel to that of language. He also finds the expression paralanguage problematic as it is not something parallel to language or capable of being separately investigated. Rather, it is deeply intertwined and hence needs to be explored in relation to language and in relation to the conversations that we engage in through the use of language. So, instead of paralanguage, Abercrombie prefers the use of the expression paralinguistic phenomena to broadly account for all the non-verbal cues that underlie the words and sentences which are articulate while conversing. Paralinguistic phenomena are known linguistic elements in conversation. They occur alongside spoken language, interact with it, and produce together with it a total system of communication. They are not necessarily continuously simultaneous with spoken words. They may also be interspersed among them or precede them or follow them, but they are always integrated into a conversation considered as a complete linguistic interaction. The study of paralinguistic behavior is part of the study of conversation. The conversational use of spoken language cannot be properly understood unless paralinguistic elements are taken into account. IBID. Now that we have an idea about the different aspects of communication and why communication skills are indispensable, we will move to the next unit. According to the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary, formality is defined as rigid observance of convention or etiquettes. Another pertinent definition would be strictly conventional behavior. So, formality comes with a set of codes or a set of distinctive features that sets it apart from informality. Domains are categorized as formal and informal on the basis of formality. How do we understand formality? Well, there are few approaches to understanding it. A number of linguists a number of linguists have interestingly explored the idea of formality by looking at different communities. As Judith Irwin attempts to summarize the tenets of these approaches comprehensively in her paper Formality and Informality in Speech Events in 1978, she described how formality can be deciphered in the sense of an increased structuring and predictability of our use of language and also as a way of describing characteristics of a social situation, so that a formal situation requires a display of seriousness, politeness and respect. Bricker 1974 and Gosson 1974, on the basis of their work on the Mayan speech community, and Fox 1974 looking into the Rotinic speech community, infer formal speech as distinct due to special structuring, particularly redundancy and syntactic or semantic plagiarism. Parallelism. Rubin 1968 in her paper Bilingual usage in Paraguay delves into how people switch between Spanish, treated as high variety, and Guarani, treated as low variety, in Paraguay. And while doing so, she analyzes formality in language based on what kind of linguistic behavior are acceptable in formal situations and how much of deviation from a defined standard can be permitted with regard to language use in such situations. Fisher in 1972, in his paper on how the Trickies and Pohnpeian speech communities use language to interact, explicates a formal situation as linguistically marked by the incorporation of respect, vocabulary, and formal etiquettes to demonstrate politeness in language use. Fishman 1972 outlines formal situations as lecture-like and associates formality with non-frivolous and impersonal use of language like Fischer. Irving Tripp 1972 also considers the display of linguistic politeness to be characteristic of formal situations alongside the seriousness of such situations. On the basis of these observations, we do realize that formally is a variable affecting the situation or the domain where the language users are physically or virtually placed, and it influences the way we use language in an empirically verified able manner. Formal domains are those social spaces of in language use where we need to be serious and precise about the topic of conversation, keeping in mind the professional context, and we also need to display linguistic politeness and respect in accordance with the organizational hierarchy and the standard organizational etiquettes. Our workplaces, our offices, our universities, our examination halls are impersonal and formal spaces which we share with our colleagues or professors or fellow students or seniors positioned varyingly in the organizational or workplace or academic hierarchy. Therefore, we almost always need to be serious, precise, structured, and courteous in the way we use language to initiate or to participate in an impersonal conversation, to propose a collaboration or to decide upon the terms of an academic association, etc. Except for those rare moments when a joke or a frivolous exchange of words or a light banter is acceptable to break the monotony within the formal or the official domain. Even with regard to formal domains, the level or standard of formality often varies from one domain to another. What is considered to be formal in the administrative building of your university may be dissimilar from what is formal in the branch manager's office of a private sector bank. So we are looking at certain norms and structures of language use. We will next look at the intricacies of a formal conversation. But before we do that, formal conversation and formal use of language. What is formal conversation? A formal conversation is quite simply a conversation that takes place in a formal domain to address an official or domain specific purpose. Note concerning the personal interests of the participants, whereby the participants adhere to the formal use of language. Use of language. A formal conversation has its own distinct components. A formal conversation is set in motion with the participants formally greeting each other, followed by a formal introduction and subsequent moving on to the specific topic or the focus of the conversation. The participants exchange their ideas and reach the conclusion in accordance with the protocols of the formal use of language. The participants end the conversation through a formal exchange of goodbye, formal greetings to initiate a formal conversation, sample opening sentences. Hello, Mr. Singh or hello, Mrs. Singh. Sample response acknowledging the greeting. Hello, Mr. Kumar or hello, Mrs. Kumar. Sample opening sentence. Hello, Professor. Sample response acknowledging the greetings. Hello, Arjun or hello, Geeta. Good morning, Mr. Singh or good morning, Mrs. Singh. Sample response acknowledging the greeting. Good morning, Mr. Kumar. Good morning, Mrs. Kumar. Sample opening sentence. Good afternoon. Sample response acknowledging the greeting. Good afternoon. Sample opening sentence. Good evening, Professor. Sample response acknowledging the greeting. Good evening, Arjun. Good evening, Geeta. Sample opening sentence. How are you? Sample response acknowledging the greeting. Fine, thank you. Formal introduction before moving on to the topic of the conversation. Sample formal introduction. Mr. Singh, let me introduce myself. I am Arjun Sehgal, a final year student of the undergraduate program in humanities at Indira Gandhi National Open University. Sample response. It's pleasure to meet you, Arjun. Pleased to meet you, Arjun. Sample formal introduction. Mr. Singh, I would like to introduce you to Mr. Gupta, or Mr. Singh, I would like to introduce you to Mrs. Sharma, or Mr. Singh, allow me to introduce you to Mr. Gupta, or Mr. Singh, allow me to introduce you to Mrs. Sharma. Sample response. It's pleasure to meet you, Mr. Gupta, or it's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Sharma, or pleased to meet you, Mr. Gupta, or please to meet you, Mrs. Sharma. Now coming to the specific topic of the conversation, how do we characterize the formal use of language? For instance, the formal use of English in our case, some of the observable features of the use of English in formal conversations are tabulated with example. Contractions are strictly not preferred in the formal domain or in a formal conversations. Formal use of language. The results will not be announced till the end of the year. The manager is going to announce an early retirement. This cannot be quite accurate. This information is not be trusted. As opposed to, they won't announce the results till the year end. The manager gonna announce an early retirement. This can't be real. I don't trust this information. So these are contractions are strictly not preferred in the formal domain or in formal conversation. Phrasal verbs are not preferred in the formal domain or in formal conversations. Only a handful of formal phrasal verbs are infrequently used. Formal use of language. The lack of cheaper options is frustrating the targeted segment of customers. The store in charge gave the keys to the security guard. The newcomers should not be so stressed and socialized with their seniors. The caretaker should leave at this very moment. In opposed to the lack of cheaper options is putting the targeted segment of customers off. The store in charge handed over the keys to the security guard. The freshers need to loosen up and hang out with their seniors. The caretaker should buzz off right now. Interrogative constructions. Interrogative constructions with modal verbs are preferred in the formal domain or informal conversations. Formal use of language. Can you explain the benefit of this move? In as opposed to. What is the benefit of this move? Could we schedule this meeting for a later time? As opposed to schedule this meeting for a later time. May I have another cup of tea, please? In opposed to I want another cup of tea. Informal use of language. Might I suggest a different issue for our next seminar? In opposed to I want to suggest a different issue for our next seminar. Colloquial expressions and slangs are never. Informal use of language. His nonsensical attitude is very frustrating. As opposed to I am sick of his bullshit attitude. The engineer lost his job for his irrelevant excuses. In opposed to the engineer got fired for his lame excuses. Allowed in the formal domain or in informal conversation. In formal language, it would be appreciable if you leave us alone. In opposed to why don't you just fuck off? Why don't you just fuck off? In formal language, the newcomer's presentation was absolutely unimpressive. In opposed to it, the newbie's presentation absolutely sucked. In certain formal situations, first person pronouns are avoided in a conversation. To achieve this, the passive form of the verb is used. This bypasses the issue of being responsible for the action and is intentionally done by the speaker when he or she does not want to claim agency. In the formal language, the listeners were questioned about their past work experiences and job profiles. In opposed to it, I asked the interns about their past work experiences and job profiles. In formal language, our journalists have been trained to investigate incidents regardless of the actual ground challenges and adversities. In opposed to it, we have trained our journalists to investigate incidents regardless of the actual ground challenges and adversities. In formal language, during the meeting with the professor, my state of work was discussed. In opposed to it, during my meeting with my professor, I discussed my state of work. In formal language, when it comes to taking risk, there is no second thought. In opposed to it, when it comes to taking risk, we never think twice. Evidently, the formal use of English involves longer complete sentences with perfect grammar. A formal conversation takes more time than an informal ones. There is also the rejection of any and all colloquialities. Complex and compound sentences are in greater proportion. Questions are posed using an indirect grammatical structure. There is general tendency to incorporate indirect verbal phrases like appears to be, seems to be, etc. Finally, once the participants have concluded, there is the exchange of formal goodbyes, ending the formal conversation with an exchange of formal goodbye. Sample formal goodbye. It was nice meeting you, Mr. Singh. Sample formal response. It was nice meeting you too, Mr. Kumar. Sample formal goodbye. It was good to see you, Professor. Sample formal response. It was good to see you too, Arjun. It was good to see you too, Geeta. Have a good day, Mr. Singh. Have a good day, Professor. Thank you. I wish you the same. Good night or goodbye. Good night or goodbye. Intricacies. Intricacies of speaking. Intricacies of speaking with reference to a formal conversation. In a formal conversation, we need to be meticulous about certain aspects while speaking. With respect to the content of a formal conversation, as speakers, we need to ensure that all of the articulated ideas and personal opinions are highly pertinent as well as satisfy the requirements of the conversation along with the topic around which it revolves. The conversation progresses in clear, distinct parts that highlight a structured pattern of expression of ideas, means solution oriented, analytic, and ordered, with smooth and effective transitions. With respect to the use of language in a formal conversation, as speakers, we must demonstrate an impactful command over the language and be confident in using it. We should express ideas with clarity and power. As a result, the meaning of the message and the flow of thoughts can be easily followed by the listener. With respect to the aspect of delivery in a formal conversation, as speakers, we need to articulate our perspectives in a strong and perfectly audible voice and appropriate stress variations to create interest and grab the focus of the listener. There has to be intelligent use of vocal modulation while consistently maintaining eye contact with the listener without any abrupt lapses or pauses that can break the flow and thereby affect the listener's impression. With respect, the organization of ideas and professionalism in a formal conversation. As speakers, our message must convey the sense of a purposeful whole with one predominant objective that is rationally actualized through the entirely of the conversation. A well articulated message will not require repetition or restatement, even when the content or the objective is somewhat complicated. The way we speak and the way we appear must be in compliance of the decorum, conventions and protocols of the formal space where the conversation is taking place or is supposed to take place. We should also be particular about the issue of ethical persuasion, whereby we support claims with compelling evidence, that is, quantitative and qualitative, from appropriate sources. With respect to the aspect of appeal in a formal conversation, as speakers, we need to incorporate planned elements to appeal to the personal interest and preferences of the listener while preserving the context of the presentation. In this regard, wherever and however possible, we have to study the available profile of the listener and form a perception about he or her interest and inclinations. Also, wherever feasible, appropriate highlighting techniques must be employed. With respect to engaging the listener in a formal conversation, as speakers, we need to use innovative ways to involve the listener and successfully keep them engaged without losing their attention through the clear, clever manipulation of rhetoric. Our conversational approach must be authentic, witty, and unique. With respect to concluding a formal conversation, as speakers, we need to convincingly connect the main ideas to the way we broached the unique with a precise yet pleasant ending using simple words. There has to be an understandable transition to the ending, and the listener should be strategically prepared for it. Similarly, in a formal conversation, we need to cautiously avoid certain blunders. With respect to the content of a formal conversation, as speakers, we must not include ideas and opinions which, although credible, are not exactly required for the objective of the conversation. Because of this, the main message will not be clearly interpretable, and the supporting arguments will require further strategic organization as well as lucidity to create the desired impact. Moreover, too frequent presence of fillers and pet phrases. For instance, okay, so the thing is like, etc. With negligible or no transitions to connect the main points can fluster the listener. With respect to the use of language in a formal conversation, as speakers, we must avoid ambiguous expressions, grammatical errors, and vocabulary slips. In addition to these, we also steer clear of expressions and arguments that can possibly puzzle or insult or offend the listener. With respect to the aspect of delivery in a formal conversation, as speakers, we should not use a lax voice with a conspicuous lack of stress and vocal variations. Having very less eye contact with the listener and not maintaining it for any effective duration can be disastrous. While speaking, if we lose track noticeably and at times even resort to the use of some digital or personal note, it becomes clear that we are not suitably prepared for the conversation. In worst case, In worst case scenario, this can seriously damage the speaker's future credibility. With respect to the organization of ideas and professionalism in a formal conversation, as speakers, we must be careful about incoherence as it will lead to a glaring lack of an overall sense of meaning. Incoherence also creates the demand of for restatement or repetition, which can compound the confusion and leave a poor impression. We should certainly never go to the extent of sounding unethical in being too persuasive without the necessary evidence or justification to support our perspectives. Desperate measures of verbal persuasion in a formal setting can prompt the listener to question the integrity of the speaker. With respect to the aspect of appeal in a formal conversation, as speakers, we should not planned elements to appeal to the personal interests and preferences of the listener that are out of sync with the context of the conversation. The comprehensibility of the message too gets blurred due to these discordant elements, and we must avoid falling into this trap. With respect, with respect to engaging the listener in a formal conversation, as speakers, we should not veer off topic as we run the risk of losing the focus of a listener, even more so in the present age with a drastic reduction in the attention spans of people. With respect to concluding a formal conversation, as speakers, we must not simply summarize or recall the main points without a carefully reasoned conclusion. When there are no perceptible transitions as we build up towards the ending, the conversation loses out on consistency and ease of understanding. 7 C's with reference to a formal conversation. According to Francis Bergin, the 7 C's determine our success as participants in formal conversation are as candidness. How do we ensure it? Candidness. As speakers, we must be honest and sincere in our statements without flattery and superficiality. When it is our time to receive a response, we should listen patiently without being guided by any sort of misplaced prejudice or bias. We should be fair to everyone in the conversation. Expressions like in any honesty, honest opinion, in my honest opinion, quite frankly, to put it fairly and directly, etc. Relay our clear stance. It exhibits how we are considerate of diverse liberates as well as of the need of everyone to know things transparently and ambiguously. Our commitment to equally informal our commitment to equally inform all in the conversation boost out credibility, and our way of speaking is characterized by the you attitude. What should we not do? If you think about it carefully, the natural instinct of children is to be very candid. This is obvious from the embarrassment of any parent has just asked in a clear, loud voice, Mommy, why does that man have no hair now? To address these embarrassing lapses from the time most of us learn to speak, we are taught to lie, not malicious lies, but airbrushed versions of the truth that are intended to make other people feel good about themselves. Most deceits of this kind have nothing to do with being formal, but of course, the habit of telling white lies inevitably colors the way we interact with others in a formal conversation in our attempt to be pleasant. So, when we compliment someone, I appreciate what you are wearing, or we must meet over lunch soon. I will call you, or you must tell me the secret to this. We are reinforcing patterns that will serve us poorly in our formal conversations. Clarity. Do's. How do we ensure it? As speakers, we must be clear and accurate about our ideas and opinions, while an impromptu deliberation on a specific issue does make it difficult for us to articulate ideas accurately as well as powerfully on the spot. We can work around it by using lucid expressions and familiar words along with appropriate stress, cautious variation of loudness and tone, as well as meaningful pauses. What should we not do? We should never incorporate statements or arguments that are not in support of the main idea and are therefore frivolous or purposeless. As equal participants in a conversation, when we are listening to somebody's feedback on what we expressed, we must never harbor any doubt or uncertainty, fearing the possibility of upsetting other participants. In fact, the loss of face is greater later on when this doubt or uncertainty leads us to make a faulty remark. Unmistakably, we must speak to edify and not to impress. Completeness. Do's. Completeness of what and how we speak is the precursor to clarity. Precursor to clarity. Acknowledging the fact that we are humans and prone to mistakes, it is possible to miss out on certain points while speaking. To minimize the chances of such inadvertent lapses, we need to pre plan and pre structure our message. The aspect of completeness demands that we supply all relevant details in a formal conversation while responsibly answering questions that listeners might have. The listeners might have, in this regard, to sufficiently quell doubts. A bit of extra clarification or extra information will not affect clarity. A helpful way to ensure that our message is complete and we are ready to respond to any question is to take the 5W questions test, that is who, what, when, where, and why, along with the allied how. Don'ts. In case we do not have the answer to a particular question, In course of a conversation, we should candidly acknowledge our present inability to address it. Beating around the bush, beating around the bush, giving evasive replies, getting defensive, etc. should be avoided as they will only amplify the confusion and create an insincere impression. Conciseness. In a formal conversation, brevity and economy of expression are golden. Verbose as regards the fact that in concise considering verbose because of the fact that in concise as or because verbose are in need of in concise need verbose not very far from here in concise nearby dons we should not repeat unless requested by another participant in a formal conversation. Furthermore, in a formal conversation, repetition does not imply emphasis. On the contrary, it implies a dearth of ideas or perspectives. Next is concreteness, specificity, and definiteness are imperative in a formal conversation. Being specific as a speaker creates a strong impression of valuing time and not being vague about the objective. More than the right amount of detail in what we speak. Concreteness is about providing the right detail for the right audience. For instance, in the field of marketing, this aspect is exploited by developing detailed profiles of ideas or typical users of a planned product and then trying to figure out what the response would be to now product or advertisement campaign. Concreteness is not just about specificity of ideas. It is about the effective specificity of ideas so that they inspire action. Don'ts. We must not use vague expressions nor incorporate vague details that cannot be empirically verified. A concrete statement comes with a verifiable source which has a proven track record of reliability. For instance, according to the Institute for Strategic Change, the stock price of well-led companies grew up by over 900% over 10 years compared with 74% for poorly led companies. According to the research cluster led by Professor Odgers at the Harvard Business School, the quality of leadership account for some 15 to 20% of the total variance in companies' performance. Correctness. In a formal conversation, grammatical errors in the form of a verb agreement errors, verb conjugation errors, prominent errors, etc. often crop up as bloopers. Don'ts. We should not stretch out sentences as it dramatically increases the chances of such errors. In courtesy, being well acquainted with the decorum of a formal conversation is crucial. Courtesy requires us to be pleasant, polite, and respectful, yet firm and determined to express our ideas with conviction, with clarity. There are norms like how many people can speak at once, how much one person should speak. It is also easy to interpret the norms by observing instances of their violation. For example, the practice of turn taking in a formal conversation indicates that only one person speaks at a time. If another participant starts speaking before the first person has finished, it is considered to be an interruption. So, in a formal conversation, The accepted norm is one person speaks at a time, and when it is clear that he or she has finished speaking, the other person may begin. Don'ts. Our tone should not be aggressive or dismissive. While speaking, our choice of words must not directly or indirectly hurt the listener's sentiment or ridicule his or her viewpoints. We must also never heckle or curse, no matter how provoked we feel. Let us now look at two sample formal conversations to get a clear idea of all that we have covered till now. Follow the conversation minutely and observe how the participants are engaging each other while adhering to the 7 C's as well as the protocols of formal English. Examples of formal conversation. The first example that we are going to look at is of a job interview, since it is something that generates a lot of tension and anxiety amongst young undergraduates and job seekers. In a hypothetical scenario, global consultancy services, a reputed software manufacturing company, has a job opening in the software evaluation department. Soumya Misra interviewed by the chief technology officer Rahil Jafar. Informal domain and informal register. This is the kind this is the third unit of the third book in your course on reading and speaking skills. We are going to explore informal conversations and realize how different they are compared to formal conversations. In the previous we have already learned how a domain in any social space of interaction where the communicative exchange or conversation takes place. Consequently, while using the spoken form of English, we need to be careful about the domain where the conversation is taking place or the domain being addressed through the use of our utterances. Based on our knowledge, based on our knowledge of formality and the nature of formal domains, we now need to understand the informal domains are the exact opposite in nature. Informal domains are those social spaces of language use where we are relaxed and spontaneous about the topic of conversation due to the personal and intimate context. We are free to display a variety of linguistic emotion in accordance with the private and frivolous nature of such interactions. Social etiquettes are also quite different from organizational etiquettes. Informal domains like the home, environment, and amusement park, a roadside eatery, etc., induce a sense of comfort and freedom of expression. To clarify this further, our homes are extremely personal spaces which we share with our immediate family members, and therefore the domain of home is characterized by the greatest degree of intimate relationships and displays of intricacy. Consequently, we very rarely need to be serious, precise, and courteous while interacting and conversing in the home domain, except for extraordinary circumstances like a medical emergency, an accident, etc. The cafeterias where we meet our friends our over coffee, the markets which we frequent for buying essential commodities, the motive the movie theaters where we enjoy the latest blockbusters, the playgrounds where we enjoy a game of cricket, the parks where we chat with our friends and laugh loudly over their jokes, change our manner of using a language. For instance, English, switching between formal and informal registers is a socio-linguistic phenomenon, and it illustrates the fact that informal domains comprise our lives and we switch codes to adapt to the communicate needs of the particular domain. Informal conversation and informal use of language. What is an informal conversation? An informal conversation is quite simply a regular conversation or a personal conversation that takes place in an informal domain. To address a regular or a personal issue, informal conversations require us to be relaxed, casual, empathetic, and open, whereby we adjust the tone of voice according to who we are speaking to, somebody much younger to us, a close friend, or a much senior family member. Use of language. An informal conversation is different from a formal one in multiple ways, including form, use of language, purpose, and content. There is absolute freedom in terms of the use of colloquial expressions, urban expressions, slang, broken utterances, etc. Naturally, there is a whole inventory of expressions that individuals tend to resort to in an informal space but avoid in a formal environment. An informal conversation has its own unique components. An informal conversation is set in motion with the participants informally greeting each other. At times with loud exclamations, vivid displays of emotion, use of nicknames, etc. Only when the participants are not known to each other. There is an informal introduction and subsequently the participants move on to the focus of the conversation. For instance, when we are introduced to a friend of a friend on and going, such informal introductions become important. Such introductions can be done introduce by an introducer. So, those who are listening, I welcome all of you in this class or in this time, place, and action of listening with 100% present sense of mind. The concept of communication have heard, listened, read, spoken, and learnt. Through these ideas, as per the concept of communication, you are to read this concept of English grammar, which is the very important part of the linguistic modules when we start learning English. So, dear brothers and sisters, you know that there are 4 modules in English learning. First is listening, then speaking, reading, and writing. Out of all these modules, we study reading is the most toughest module as per the understanding of the listeners and learners. Whenever a learner starts reading, then he must go through the technique. What is the technique? skimming. Skimming means you are not to go in deep of the words and deep meanings of the words. In deep emotional meaning words, you are not to go, but you are to simply read them. You are to simply understand them with fast speed. As fast as you can, you are to go through the passage and you are to understand that the passage is related to what. You are to understand first this thing, then this skimming will help you in understanding grossly and broadly. On the other hand, there is scanning technique that will help you in knowing the information. If you are good in getting and searching and finding out the information as soon as possible, then you must go through the questions related to that. Firstly, what information is required? Firstly, you are to go through that one, and then you try to find out the information related to that questions as soon as possible from the passage. So, dear brothers and sisters, there are two techniques in reading, skimming and scanning. But reading is the most commonest module in all the listening, reading, writing, speaking of the English, because it's the internal. It needs concentration. It needs great memory power. It needs command over the words while listening, because while listening any word, your mind stores the energy, and how much storing capacity of the energy your mind has, it depends upon that. Your mind can store the information in the form of energy in your mind, and how it can retaliate, how it can recreate the flow of energy from the mind, it depends upon that. It's a very technical and very systematic and very scientific model that is required. Pranayama, asana, dhyana, meditation. When you will meditate, when you will concentrate upon the sound, waves of sound and rays of light, then you will be the best learner of the reading skill, reading module. Out of all these four modules, listening, speaking, reading, writing, these four modules are very important for a learner. No doubt, undoubtedly, we know this thing. But when we are good, when we become good in reading, it helps us in understanding the high rise or low tone of the voice. This is the matter of intonation. If we are having the high tone in speaking, it means how and what at what level we are releasing the air from the lungs. That is more related to understanding the words. And at what scale we are releasing the air out from the lungs, it is also equally important for understanding the emotions, for understanding the passions, for understanding the thought, ideas of the writers. So passage is related to word. For understanding it, we must be scientific by keeping our soul free from other type of obstacles, hindrances that comes usually while understanding, while listening, while getting the energy inside the body in the form of air. So, dear brothers and sisters, it helps a great attention. It provides a great attention. It requires great concentration and meditation. While meditating, you are alone, but don't feel that you are alone, because presence of Lord is always with you. You never let it alone yourself. You never feel that nobody is with you, because energy is always inside in your all cells of your human body, inside all the internal organs of your human body, and your all interbody organs and every cell of your human body has the power to contain a lot of energy for a long time. If you are healthy, physically fit and fine, if you are feeling well, only in that case you can be a good reader of the passage. If you will spend your maximum time with nature, then this nature will make you common, easy, simple in understanding all about the passage related to what? how the passage is presented, what the passage is, where the passage is, and why the passage is presented. What, when, where, how. These questions will be answered automatically by the reader inside his mind when he will concentrate upon the scale of receiving the energy, the scale of releasing the energy from his mind. Then automatically will be able to understand the power of the word. If we have the common understanding of the meaning of word, then it will help a lot in understanding deeply. But everywhere it doesn't matter if you don't know the complete meaning of the word. But sense is more important than the deep meaning of the words. Sense means flow of the understanding of the sentences and words will help you lot in understanding the opinions, ideas with the rise and flow of the voice by speaking. For example, if you are having a passage in your hand and you are just passively reading that without speaking, without using your tongue and without understanding, without vibrating your lips, if you are speaking passively, then you may have feel that you are not understanding well. But if you will concentrate, if you will spend your energy in vibrating your lips, in vibrating your tongue, in vibrating your lungs, and so moreover, it if you will vibrate with your mind or mental energy, then definitely you will understand a lot of ideas and thoughts in your mind in the form of energy for storing and restoring the energy. So dear brothers and sisters, it is really nice time, nice place, nice action. You are listening the techniques through the technology, through electronology and digitology. Nowadays, it is very common for everyone to know about the understanding of inside the human body. So our human body is very rare. We are to understand it. We are to be free from the clutches of the foundations, and we are to let free our soul from the different type of obstacles, hindrances that generally come in the way of progression. Brothers and sisters, dear friends, it is really nice time, nice place, nice action. And if you will maintain your daily routine, you will get up early in the morning before rising the sun, then this sun will teach you a lot of things. This nature will make you easy, common, simple, easy and friendly, and it will communicate with you. It will make you familiarize. So environment and atmosphere is very important for keeping our healthy environment. It will help a lot. It will provide goodnesses, truthfulness. It will make you common. It will never cheat, beat, treat, deceive you, but always help you, provide you, impart you good education, good health standard. So, brothers and sisters, before going through these four modules, you are must to concentrate with meditation. What is the meditation? There are different ways of meditation. Simply, as per the thought of our present Prime Minister, as per the thought of our Swami Vivekananda, who addressed the whole world by his thoughts and ideas, it was the issue of energy. A lot of energy you have, our youth has a lot of energy. Meditation is not a difficult method for concentrating and attending any program, but our present our presence 100% present sense of mind provide us good listening, good reading, good speaking and good writing, even good learning of anything or any new language. It requires, it helps us. 100% present sense of mind, it will help you. When your body, mind will feel that you are made by five elements: air, fire, soil, sky and water. And even your body is created by the light and waves of sound. Firstly, when the God created this creation, earlier God created himself in the form of light. Later on he created 84 lakh species on the world in the form of birds, plants, creatures and all that are the helpers of the human beings. So man must understand this concept, how the God put the light, how the God created the sound in the human statues, in the human bodies, those who were totally inanimate and non-living. So this is the great result of concentration, and this concentration will come you by the words, and if you are not feeling comfortable with words, you must concentrate upon the wordless power of wave of sound and ray of light. By doing pranayama, dhyana, asana, meditation, by our traditional, by our ancient culture, by our improving our healthy, nutritious diet, by improving our purities, definitely we will be healthy. So brothers and sisters, I again thanks all of you.